The familiar creak of the front gate should have been my first warning, but I was too busy juggling my overnight bag and the box of Mom's favorite pastries from that little bakery downtown. It had been 3 months since my last visit to Austin, and guilt gnawed at my stomach as I walked up the stone pathway I'd skipped along as a child. The Texas heat was already oppressive at 9 in the morning, and sweat beaded on my forehead as I approached the wraparound porch where Dad used to read his newspaper every Sunday. But something felt different today, something that made my skin crawl with an inexplicable dread. That's when I saw it. A bright red and white "for sale" sign planted right in the middle of Mom's prized rose garden, the one she'd spent decades nurturing into a masterpiece of blooming colors. My heart stopped, and the pastry box slipped from my trembling fingers, scattering Danish and croissants across the walkway. This had to be some kind of mistake, maybe a prank from the neighborhood kids or a sign that had blown over from another property. There was absolutely no way my parents would sell this house without telling me, without discussing it as a family first. This was our sanctuary, our foundation, the place where every Christmas morning had unfolded and every birthday cake had been shared. I stood frozen on the front steps, my mind racing through every possible explanation that didn't involve my parents making such a monumental decision without me. Maybe they were just testing the market value, or perhaps someone had put the sign there as a cruel joke. My hands shook as I fumbled for my keys, the same house key I'd carried for 15 years, worn smooth from countless homecomings. The familiar weight of it in my palm usually brought comfort, but today it felt foreign and cold. I needed to get inside, needed to find Mom and Dad and clear up this obvious misunderstanding before my imagination ran completely wild. The front door opened before I could even insert the key, and there stood Donna, my older sister, looking perfectly put together in her designer blazer and that smug expression she'd perfected since childhood. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her manicured nails drummed against the doorframe with an impatience that immediately set my teeth on edge. She looked like she'd been expecting me, which was strange since I hadn't told anyone I was coming home for a surprise visit. The way she blocked the doorway, arms crossed and chin raised, reminded me of all those times growing up when she'd guard her bedroom door to keep me out of her precious space. "Emily," she said, my name dripping from her lips like she'd tasted something bitter. "What are you doing here?" Her tone was casual, but I caught the slight tremor in her voice, the same tell she'd had since we were kids whenever she was hiding something. Behind her, I could hear the familiar sounds of home, the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, the hum of the old air conditioning unit Dad refused to replace, and what sounded like Mom's voice drifting from the kitchen. Everything seemed normal, except for my sister's defensive posture and the way her eyes kept darting toward the street, as if she was watching for someone or something. "I came to surprise Mom and Dad," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the growing knot in my stomach. "But first, I need you to explain why there's a "for sale" sign in our front yard." I watched her face carefully, searching for any sign of the sister I used to build blanket forts with, the one who used to sneak me extra cookies when Mom wasn't looking. But the woman standing before me was a stranger, her expression hardening into something cold and calculating. She stepped back slightly, allowing me to enter, but her body language screamed that I wasn't welcome here, in my own childhood home. "Oh, that," Donna said, with a dismissive wave of her hand, as if we were discussing something as trivial as the weather. "Everything's already been taken care of. We found a buyer, and the paperwork is nearly finalized." The casual way she delivered this bombshell hit me like a physical blow, and I had to grip the doorframe to steady myself. "We? Since when was there a we that didn't include me when it came to family decisions?" My legs felt weak, and the familiar scent of Mom's lavender potpourri, which had always meant home and safety, now seemed cloying and suffocating. The world tilted on its axis as her words sank in, and I realized that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a mistake. This was a deliberate, calculated move that had been happening behind my back. My sister, the person who was supposed to have my back no matter what, had been orchestrating the sale of our family home without so much as a phone call to let me know. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical pain I'd ever experienced, and I could feel tears burning behind my eyes as the magnitude of what she was telling me began to register. This house, with its creaky floors and faded wallpaper, wasn't just a building. It was the repository of our entire family history, and she was selling it like it meant nothing at all. "Buyer?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper, as the reality of the situation crashed over me like a tidal wave. What buyer? And what do you mean the paperwork is finalized? Where are Mom and Dad in all of this? My questions tumbled out in rapid succession, each one more desperate than the last, but Donna just stood there with that infuriating calm that made me want to shake her until she showed some emotion. The hallway suddenly felt too small, too cramped, and the family photos lining the walls seemed to mock me with their images of happier times when we were actually a united family. I could see my 8-year-old self grinning toothlessly in one frame, Donna's arm slung protectively around my shoulders, and the irony wasn't lost on me. Donna sighed dramatically, as if my presence was nothing more than a minor inconvenience in her perfectly orchestrated plan. Stephen handled everything, she said, checking her expensive watch with the kind of practiced indifference that made my blood boil. He's the attorney managing the sale, and he's very thorough. The buyers are a lovely young couple from California. Cash offer, no contingencies. It's really the best possible outcome for everyone involved. The way she spoke about our family home like it was just another real estate transaction made me feel physically sick, and I had to swallow hard to keep from throwing up right there in the foyer where I'd taken my first steps. Best outcome for who, exactly? I demanded, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. Because I'm pretty sure I wasn't consulted about any of this. And last time I checked, I'm still part of this family. The words came out sharper than I intended, but I was beyond caring about hurt feelings at this point. Donna's perfectly composed mask slipped for just a moment, and I caught a glimpse of something that might have been guilt flickering across her features before she quickly recovered. She smoothed down her blazer and lifted her chin in that superior way that had always driven me crazy, even when we were children fighting over toys. "You live in Seattle now, Emily," she said, her tone taking on a patronizing quality that made my hands clench into fists. "You have your own life, your own career, your own problems to worry about. Mom and Dad needed someone here, someone who could handle the practical aspects of their situation." The implication hung heavy in the air between us, that I had somehow abandoned our parents by moving away for work, that I was the irresponsible daughter who couldn't be trusted with important family decisions. It was a low blow, and she knew it. But that had never stopped Donna from going for the jugular when she felt cornered. "Their situation?" I repeated, my voice cracking with emotion. "What situation? They seemed fine when I talked to them last week. Dad was complaining about his tomatoes not growing fast enough, and Mom was excited about her book club's next selection. They didn't sound like people who were planning to sell their home and uproot their entire lives." My mind raced back through our recent phone conversations, searching for any clue I might have missed, any hint that something this monumental was brewing beneath the surface. But there had been nothing, absolutely nothing to suggest that such a drastic change was even being considered. Donna's expression softened slightly, but there was something calculated about it, like she was putting on a performance for my benefit. "They're getting older, Emily. They can't maintain this big house forever, and the neighborhood isn't what it used to be. This sale will give them the financial security they need for their retirement, maybe even enough to move into one of those nice assisted living communities with activities and medical care on site." Her words sounded rehearsed, like she'd practiced this speech in front of a mirror, and I could hear the hollow ring of justification in every syllable. She was trying to make this sound like an act of love and responsibility, but all I could hear was the sound of my childhood being auctioned off to the highest bidder. "And you made this decision for them?" I asked, my voice deadly quiet now, as the full scope of her betrayal began to crystallize in my mind. "You decided what was best for our parents without consulting them? Without consulting me? Without consulting anyone except your precious attorney, Stephen?" The name came out like a curse, and I could see Donna flinch slightly at the venom in my tone. I thought about all the times she'd accused me of being selfish, of putting my own needs first, and here she was doing exactly that on a scale I never could have imagined. The hypocrisy was staggering, and it took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to scream at her right there in the hallway. "I didn't make the decision for them," Donna said, but her voice lacked conviction, and she couldn't quite meet my eyes when she spoke. "I simply presented them with the facts and helped them see the practical benefits of selling now while the market is strong. Stephen explained all the legal aspects, and they agreed that it was the right move for their future security. But even as she said the words, I could see the doubt creeping into her expression, the tiny cracks in her confident facade that told me there was more to this story than she was letting on. My sister had always been a terrible liar, despite her best efforts to appear sophisticated and in control. I want to talk to them, I said firmly, pushing past Donna into the house that suddenly felt foreign and unwelcoming despite being the place where I'd grown up. I want to hear this from Mom and Dad themselves, because something about this whole situation stinks to high heaven. My footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors that Dad had refinished himself 3 summers ago, and every familiar creak and groan of the old house seemed to be crying out against this betrayal. The living room looked exactly the same. Mom's collection of ceramic angels on the mantelpiece, Dad's reading chair with the worn armrest where he'd rested his coffee mug for decades, the family quilt draped over the back of the sofa that Grandma had made before I was born. But Donna caught my arm before I could make it to the kitchen, her manicured nails digging into my skin with surprising strength. "They're not here," she said quickly, and I could hear the panic creeping into her voice despite her attempts to maintain control. "They went to visit Aunt Margaret in Dallas for a few days. They won't be back until next week, and by then, well, the closing will be scheduled and everything will be official." The timing was too convenient, too perfectly orchestrated, and my suspicions crystallized into cold, hard certainty that my sister was manipulating this entire situation for her own benefit. "How convenient," I said, jerking my arm free from her grip and turning to face her with all the fury I'd been holding back. "They just happened to leave town right when you're finalizing the sale of their home. Tell me, Donna, did you encourage this little trip to Dallas? Did you maybe suggest that now would be a perfect time for them to visit family while you handled all the tedious paperwork?" The sarcasm dripped from my words like acid, and I watched as her face flushed red with either anger or embarrassment. I couldn't tell which, and frankly, I didn't care anymore. "You're being ridiculous," she snapped, but her defensive posture told a different story. "I'm trying to help our parents secure their future, and all you can do is throw around wild accusations like some kind of conspiracy theorist. Maybe if you'd been more involved in their lives instead of gallivanting around Seattle playing house, you'd understand the gravity of their situation." Her words hit their intended target, and I felt the familiar sting of guilt that she'd always been so skilled at inflicting. But this time, I wasn't going to let her turn this around on me. Wasn't going to let her make me the villain in her twisted narrative. "Playing house," I repeated, my voice rising to match hers. "I've been building a career, supporting myself, living my life like a normal adult, and I call them every week, send care packages, visit whenever I can manage the time off work. Don't you dare try to paint me as the neglectful daughter when you're the one selling their home out from under them." The accusation hung in the air between us, and for a moment, I saw something flicker across Donna's face. Was it shame, fear, or just annoyance at being called out on her schemes? My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out to see a text from an unknown local number. "Ms. Patterson, this is Stephen Michaels. Your sister mentioned you might have questions about the property sale. I'm available to meet this afternoon if you'd like to review the documentation. Best regards." The message felt like a punch to the gut, confirmation that this wasn't some spur-of-the-moment decision, but a carefully planned operation that had been in motion for who knows how long. I showed the screen to Donna, watching as her face went pale beneath her perfectly applied makeup. "You gave him my number?" I asked, my voice deadly quiet now as the pieces of her deception began falling into place. "You've been planning this for weeks, maybe months, and you've been coordinating with your attorney friend to make sure everything was locked down tight before I could interfere. This isn't about Mom and Dad's welfare at all, is it? This is about something else entirely." I could see the truth written all over her face, in the way her eyes darted away from mine, in the nervous way she twisted her wedding ring around her finger. "I don't know what you're implying," Donna said, but her voice had lost all its earlier confidence, and she sounded more like the scared little girl who used to hide behind Mom's skirts when she'd broken something valuable. "Stephen is a family friend, and he's been incredibly helpful in navigating the legal complexities of the sale. If you want to meet with him, that's your choice. But I think you'll find that everything has been handled properly and in our parents' best interests." But even as she spoke the words, I could see the cracks widening in her story, the inconsistencies that she couldn't quite cover with her polished exterior. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 11 times, each note echoing through the house like a countdown to disaster, and I realized that I was running out of time to stop whatever scheme my sister had set in motion. The house that had always been my safe haven, my anchor in an uncertain world, was slipping away from our family, and the person I'd trusted most in the world was the one holding the knife. I looked around the living room one more time, memorizing every detail, every cherished memory embedded in these walls, because I had a sinking feeling that no matter what I did next, nothing would ever be the same again. I texted Stephen back immediately, my fingers flying over the keyboard with desperate urgency. "I'll be there in an hour. Please bring all documentation related to this sale." I didn't wait for Donna's response or permission. I was done playing by her rules, done being the accommodating little sister who trusted family blindly. The drive to Stephen's office felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life, my mind racing through every possible scenario, every legal loophole that might save our family home from this nightmare. The Austin traffic seemed to conspire against me. Every red light an eternity, every slow driver an obstacle between me and the truth I desperately needed to uncover. Stephen Michaels's office was located in one of those sleek downtown buildings that screamed expensive legal services, all glass and steel and intimidating marble lobbies. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-30s, with the kind of polished appearance that suggested he specialized in high-stakes real estate deals rather than family law. His handshake was firm but brief, and his smile never quite reached his eyes as he gestured for me to take a seat across from his imposing mahogany desk. The office walls were lined with diplomas and awards, but all I could focus on was the manila folder sitting in front of him, thick with documents that apparently sealed my family's fate. "Ms. Patterson," he began, his voice smooth and professional in that way that lawyers perfect to sound both authoritative and sympathetic. "I understand you have some concerns about your parents' decision to sell their property. I want to assure you that everything has been handled according to Texas state law, and all parties have been properly represented throughout this process." He opened the folder and began spreading papers across the desk, each document looking official and final and absolutely terrifying. I could see signatures that looked like my parents' handwriting, but something about them seemed off, shaky and uncertain in a way that didn't match their usual confident penmanship. "When exactly did my parents sign these papers?" I asked, leaning forward to get a better look at the documents while trying to keep my voice steady and professional. "Because I spoke with them just last week, and they didn't mention anything about selling the house, which seems like the kind of thing they might bring up in conversation." Stephen's expression didn't change, but I caught a slight hesitation before he answered, a tiny pause that set off every alarm bell in my head. He shuffled through the papers, pulling out what appeared to be a deed transfer document with a date from 3 weeks ago. "The initial paperwork was signed on the 15th of last month," he said, pointing to the date with his expensive pen. "Your sister arranged the meeting here in my office, and both your parents were present and appeared to understand the nature of the transaction. They seemed quite pleased with the financial terms, actually, and expressed gratitude that Donna had found such qualified buyers." But as he spoke, I noticed that his eyes kept darting to his computer screen, and there was something in his tone that suggested he was reciting a prepared statement rather than recounting actual events. "I'd like to see the original documents," I said firmly, extending my hand across the desk. "Not copies, not summaries, but the actual papers my parents supposedly signed." Stephen's professional mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw something that looked suspiciously like panic flash across his features before he quickly recovered his composure. He cleared his throat and began gathering the papers back into the folder, his movements suddenly rushed and defensive in a way that confirmed my growing suspicions that something was very wrong with this entire situation. "I'm afraid I can't release original documents without proper authorization," he said, his voice taking on a more formal, legal tone that sounded like he was reading from a script. "However, I can assure you that everything was witnessed and notarized according to state requirements. Your parents were of sound mind and body when they made this decision, and they expressed their desire to simplify their lives and ensure their financial security in their golden years." But even as he spoke, I could see beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the aggressive air conditioning in his office. Something in his nervous energy triggered a memory from my childhood, the way Donna used to fidget with her jewelry when she was lying about breaking Mom's favorite vase or eating the last piece of cake. I studied Stephen's face more carefully, noting the way he avoided direct eye contact and the slight tremor in his hands as he closed the folder. "Mr. Michaels," I said slowly, my voice taking on the kind of steel I'd learned to use in difficult business negotiations. "I think there's something you're not telling me about how this sale came to be arranged." The silence stretched between us for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. Stephen's professional facade was crumbling before my eyes, and I could see the internal struggle playing out across his features as he weighed his options. Finally, he sighed deeply and looked directly at me for the first time since I'd entered his office. And what I saw in his eyes made my blood run cold. It was guilt, pure and simple, the look of a man who knew he'd been caught in something he couldn't justify or explain away with legal jargon and professional courtesy. "Your sister told your parents it was an insurance document," Stephen finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper as the weight of his confession settled between us like a lead blanket. "She said it was something about protecting the house in case of medical emergencies, that it would ensure they could access equity if they needed expensive care. They trusted her completely. Why wouldn't they? She's their daughter, and she presented it so convincingly that even I almost believed her story at first." His words hit me like physical blows, each revelation more devastating than the last, and I felt the room spinning around me as the full scope of Donna's betrayal became crystal clear. My sister hadn't just sold our family home. She had manipulated and deceived our elderly parents into signing away their most precious possession under completely false pretenses. The woman I'd looked up to my entire life, the sister who had taught me to ride a bike and helped me with homework, had become someone I didn't recognize at all. I drove back to the house in a fury that burned hotter than the Texas sun, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had turned white. The legal documents Stephen had reluctantly shown me were damning evidence of fraud, and I had already called the district attorney's office to report what amounted to elder abuse and document falsification. When I burst through the front door, Donna was pacing in the living room, her phone pressed to her ear, frantically trying to reach someone, probably the buyers or another accomplice in her scheme. She looked up when she heard me enter, and the guilt written across her face told me everything I needed to know about her awareness of what she'd done. "The sale is off," I announced, my voice cutting through her phone conversation like a blade. "I know what you did, Donna. I know how you tricked them into signing those papers, and I'm going to make sure everyone else knows too." The confrontation that followed was unlike anything we'd ever experienced as sisters, a screaming match that shattered 32 years of shared history and family bonds. Donna tried to justify her actions, claiming she was protecting our parents' financial future, insisting that they were too old to make rational decisions about their property. But her arguments fell apart under the weight of the evidence, and eventually she broke down completely, admitting that she'd been facing her own financial crisis and had seen the house sale as her salvation. She'd convinced herself that our parents would be better off in assisted living anyway, that she was doing them a favor by forcing this transition before they became too frail to handle it themselves. The selfishness and manipulation behind her reasoning made me physically sick, and I realized that the sister I'd loved and trusted my entire life had never really existed at all. When Mom and Dad returned from Dallas 3 days later, the truth came out in a devastating family meeting that left everyone in tears. They were horrified to learn what Donna had done, heartbroken that their own daughter had deceived them so completely, and ashamed that they'd been so easily manipulated. The legal proceedings that followed were swift but painful, with Donna facing charges for elder fraud and document falsification that would likely result in jail time and the complete destruction of her professional reputation. Our parents kept their house, but the damage to our family was irreparable. Trust had been shattered, relationships had been destroyed, and the sanctuary of our childhood home now carried the bitter taste of betrayal. As I helped Mom tend to her rose garden the following weekend, carefully removing the "for sale" sign that had started this nightmare, I couldn't help but wonder if we'd ever be able to heal from the wounds that Donna's greed and deception had inflicted on all of us.